All right, so while people are joining us for today's meeting of the Cognitive Ontology seminar at the Center for Philosophy of Science, organized by Professor Adina Roskis and myself, I wanted to remind you of the last event that's going to happen this semester. Next week on Thursday at 10, we'll have our last keynote speaker, Carl Craver, who will be giving a lecture again on Zoom in the Cognitive Ontology seminar, 10 a.m. on Thursday next week. And you're all invited to join us. If you haven't registered for this event, please go online to the center's website and find a Zoom link on the calendar of the center's events this semester. Next semester, we will be online for at least for most of the semester and probably for the whole semester. We are back in the saddle on January 19th with a debate about the modeling of COVID between a Harvard epidemiologist whose name I'm blanking on now, and one of my colleagues in HPS. So we hope to see you in January. On the week of the 19th, we also have an online conference on ancestry and how to infer people's ancestry and what it means from a social point of view, organized by Mike Dietrich. So again, you can see all these events on the center's website on the calendar. And without further ado, Adina, the floor is yours.
Great. Can you guys see me? Yes, okay, great. So very happy to have Joe McCaffrey here. Joe comes to us from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He is an assistant professor of philosophy and part of the medical humanities faculty. Joe got his PhD at Pitt in the HPS program and was a postdoctoral fellow at Washington University at in the PNP program. And his research interests lie in epistemological issues in cognitive neuroscience, and especially in neuroimaging, and in how empirical approaches such as cognitive psychology and neuropsychology can inform traditional issues in the philosophy of mind. He's working on issues like functional localization in complex systems, and in the question on whether or how imaging experiments can be used to test psychological theories. The title of his talk today is Atlas of the Mind, Neural Degeneracy and Pluralistic Ontologies. And so we're really happy to have Joe McCaffrey here with us for the second to last cognitive ontology lecture. Thanks, Joe.
Adina, thank you so much for inviting me to the conference and for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to be back virtually at Pittsburgh. I've even got my mug, my Pittsburgh mug to show for it. It's too bad I can't be there in person, but it's a rare, in some ways a rare terror, I suppose, to be giving a talk in front of my former my dissertation advisor at Ward. But it's a rare pleasure to be here among friends and talking to you today about this topic. So thanks to all the organizers, Alex and Trey and Morgan and Adina and Edward and everyone for making this happen. And yeah, without more preamble, I'll get on to the talk. So today I'm going to present this talk, Atlas of the Mind, Neural Degeneracy and Pluralistic Cognitive Ontologies. I wanted to start with a little bit of where talks often end and thank my collaborator, the wonderful philosopher, Jesse Wright, who I collaborated with this summer on a paper that is coming out in a volume being edited by Philippe de Brigard and Walter Sinnott Armstrong called Neuroscience and Philosophy, Bringing the Fields Together. And so we wrote this paper called Neuroscience and Cognitive Ontologies, a case for pluralism. And I'll also rep that the work that we did together, this talk comes out of this paper in many ways, and also that this work came out of time with Jesse at the summer seminars in neuroscience and philosophy at Duke, run by Walter and Felipe in August of 2019. So this is where we had some of the conversations that spurred the talk today. So I wanted to give Jesse a hearty thanks for his role in my thinking about this project. The debate about cognitive ontology as expressed by Michael Anderson in a wonderful article called Mining the Brain for a New Taxonomy of the Mind, is ultimately a debate about the right taxonomy, my emphasis, for understanding human cognition. That is, the right theory of and vocabulary for describing the structure of the mind, its constituent operations and functions, and a theoretical, or sorry, a methodological debate about the proper role of neuroscience in specifying this taxonomy. So one of the major questions in the debate about cognitive ontology is, what are the right concepts for understanding the human mind? Are concepts like response inhibition and working memory going to enter into our mature science of the mind and brain? And another question is, what role does studying neural structures and neural mechanisms play in deciding whether we have the right ontology? One of the reasons I put an emphasis in talking about Anderson on this language about the right taxonomy for understanding the mind is I think we should ask if there is one single correct taxonomy for understanding the mind. And so the main questions I'm going to address in today's talk, the big picture questions that I have in mind for this research. The first is the question of taxonomic monism versus taxonomic pluralism in cognitive ontology. And so this is the question of whether there is or could be a single correct taxonomy of mental kinds. Could there someday be a unified cognitive ontology, or do the mind-brain sciences, cognitive neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology need multiple cognitive ontologies, multiple different ways of expressing the structure of the mind? And I'm also going to ask a question about the role of neuroscience. So in the back of your mind, keep this question: what is the role of neuroscience in determining or constraining our cognitive ontologies? And mainly, the question I'll ask today is, will every item in a scientifically valid cognitive ontology correspond to some distinct neural mechanism or some distinct neural kind? And I'm going to answer this question. So to the first question, I'm going to say that we likely need to embrace taxonomic pluralism of some form in cognitive ontology development. And I'm going to argue that while our ontology should be highly informed by neural data, that actually every item in a scientifically valid cognitive ontology probably will not correspond uniquely to one distinct neural mechanism or kind. So we currently have efforts to taxonomize the mind, and these are becoming very sophisticated compared to where the project of individuating mental faculties or the project of cognitive ontology arguably began, with faculty psychologists like Thomas Reid or phrenologists and neuroanatomists like Franz Gall. And so I just want to point out that Franz Gall in the 19th century, associated with phrenology, but also a founding figure in functional localization of the brain, recognized 27 distinct mental faculties derived from studies of talented individuals. So noticing you could be, talented at math without being talented at poetry, and also patterns of brain damage. That brain damage could result in, trouble with spatial relations, but not necessarily trouble for reasoning. We've come a very long way from Gall. So a program constructed by Russ Poldrack at Stanford and others, for example, in this 2011 paper, the Cognitive Atlas is currently a searchable database of 869, as of the moment of this talk, cognitive concepts or constructs, and 777 tasks that are thought to engage them. And the goal of the Cognitive Atlas, which is a searchable wiki-inspired database, so you can go and look at, what cognitive concepts there are, like, working memory or reading or orthography or response inhibition, to find out what tasks are supposed to engage them, kind of chart the structure of the mind. And the aim of the Cognitive Atlas is to provide a systematic characterization of the broad range of cognitive processes. And so we might ask, could a project like this someday stand as some kind of periodic table or agreed upon, scientific depiction of the mind's basic ingredients or basic operations? And so that's a question about ontology. I want to say a little bit then about the role of neuroscience, and then kind of segue into the main argument for the talk. So I want to contrast. So if we ask, well, what is the role that neuroscience plays in constructing cognitive ontologies like the Cognitive Atlas and in determining what the right vocabulary and concepts for talking about the mind are? And here I'm contrasting a quote by Russ Poldrack and a quote by Felipe de Brigard. And I'm going to say that in my talk, I'm going to be kind of siding with de Brigard's view of things. So in a wonderful paper from 2010 about how cognitive neuroimaging can succeed, Russ Poldrack articulates the idea that ultimately our valid cognitive ontologies are going to have items that correspond in some systematic or selective fashion to patterns of brain activation. So Poldrack says neuroimaging relies on a theory about the structure of the mind that specifies the component operations that comprise mental function, which I'll refer to as a cognitive ontology. This ontology describes the parts of the mind, which are the things that cognitive neuroimaging aims to map onto brain structure. And then Poldrack says, provocatively, correctness of the ontology would be reflected in selective association, one-to-one mappings, between brain structures and cognitive functions. That is, if a specific structure or network is activated in association with only one putative cognitive process, then one could argue that the reality of this process has been established. I'm not sure, it might be too strong to say that Poldrack thinks it is necessary for a valid item in an ontology to correspond to a specific brain process in a selective mapping, but he at least takes it as sufficient, that this is the goal, right? That it suffices to establish the reality of one of these processes if there is some specific brain region it's associated with. On the other hand, Felipe de Brigard cautions in an article he wrote in 2014 that we maybe shouldn't expect the concepts of psychology to be sort of readable in some, very strict way from just kind of running your finger over the surface of the brain and counting its parts and its mechanisms. And so here de Brigard says, the organizational principles of the brain might not mirror the categories we use to describe the mind's many functions. The brain is not an atlas of the mind. And so in this talk, I'm going to agree with Felipe that strictly speaking, that the functions, the mechanisms of the brain do not furnish us with an atlas of the mind. And then I'm going to ask, well, what might an atlas of the mind look like if that's not the case? And that's where I'll finish the talk. So now I'm going to summarize the main argument, and I will go into all of this in much more detail later. But my main argument is that the cognitive functions, broadly speaking, performed by brain areas should enter into our cognitive ontology. We should want to capture what it is that brain areas contribute to our higher cognitive capacities, such as reading or reasoning or spatial navigation. But that the human brain, at large scales relevant to cognition, exhibits a phenomenon called neural degeneracy, whereby different arrangements of structural elements or different coalitions of regions perform in some sense the same higher level capacity. I argue that many such cases are not examples of redundancy, where there are repeated structural elements that do the same job or reduplicated computations. So where different parts of the brain actually make the same exact mechanical contribution or computational contribution to higher cognition. I don't think that's the case. And so we are actually looking at degeneracy rather than redundancy. So the contributions these regions make to these higher level capacities are computationally and mechanistically distinguishable on some analyses or under some conditions, but are virtually interchangeable on others. Thus, I argue that capturing the common functions that these regions perform requires lumping for cognitive ontology development, and that capturing the differences in certain contexts requires splitting. I conclude that dealing with neural degeneracy requires taxonomic pluralism, since an ontology that lumps two functions together is incompatible in some representational sense with a taxonomy that splits them. And so we need to adopt plural taxonomies in this field. So an outline of the argument, which I will kind of race through as we go. So first, I'm going to talk about the problem of so-called many-to-one mappings. Then I'm going to talk about the phenomenon of neural degeneracy in cognitive neuroscience. I'm going to briefly outline that neural degeneracy is a widely studied phenomenon in basic neurobiology, studied in invertebrate systems. And then I'm going to give several examples of neural degeneracy in cognitive neuroscience. Some of these are quite well established, some are newer and more speculative. And then I'm going to argue that degeneracy necessitates or requires plural ontologies in which we sometimes lump and sometimes split. I'm going to address what I take to be one of the most important objections to the argument I'm presenting today. Why not always split our ontologies when we find differences in underlying mechanisms. And then I will conclude with some reflections on this concept of an atlas of the mind. So here in this first part on the so-called problem of many-to-one mappings, where there are many different brain areas, N1 and 2 and 3, associated with a single mental function. And thanks to Marco Viola for these wonderful figures from his 2017 paper and his wonderful conceptual analysis of this. So here I'm going to make a few claims. I'm going to claim that network mappings, neural redundancy, and neural degeneracy are all in some sense a many-to-one mapping between brain areas and psychological categories, and we should be careful to distinguish them. And I'm going to argue that only neural degeneracy poses a true problem for the construction of cognitive ontologies. So first, I want to just express the familiar idea that there's kind of a dream to achieve one-to-one mappings between brain structures as we know them, say areas of the cerebral cortex, and psychological functions as we know them, say working memory, response inhibition, or orthographic coding. And if the brain exhibited some kind of interpretable, systematic, or one-to-one mapping between neural kinds or psychological kinds, neural kinds and cognitive or psychological kinds, then brain data would not put much strain on our cognitive ontology. However, as Poldrack notes, a review of the neuroimaging literature, and I would argue the neuropsychological literature as well, suggests that a selective one-to-one association between mental processes and brain structures is currently impossible to find. Although popular accounts often imply, things like the amygdala as a fear area, closer examination of nearly every such claim uncovers counterexamples that are different to reconcile. So what we have is a problem that's sometimes called the problem of the many-to-many. On one hand, so the brain does not seem to exhibit, at least given our current measurement techniques and concepts, a one-to-one mapping between mental kinds and brain areas. Instead, it appears to exhibit multifunctionality or pluripotency, one-to-many mappings, where one brain area is involved in multiple cognitive functions, like the insula is involved in both visual attention and also primary taste sensation, right? But also the brain appears to exhibit so-called many-to-one mappings, where a single mental kind, this is here in red, is associated with multiple neural structures. And these do pose problems for the construction of cognitive ontologies, because if we suppose that a region like the insula performs a single function, which we should not necessarily, but on the presumption that brain areas sort of do one thing, we might need a new taxonomy to explain how it is that an area involved in visual attention can also be involved in primary taste sensation, right? And so I'm going to talk in this brief portion of the talk just about the problems for cognitive ontology posed by many-to-one mappings, or cases where one function seems to be associated with multiple different brain regions. And I just want to clarify the issue because sometimes I think there's confusion about this issue in print. So what is meant by a many-to-one mapping between brain areas, N1, N2, and N3, and some cognitive kind like M3 over here? Well, there's a few different options. So one, the cognitive kind could map onto a distributed network of brain areas that conjointly exercise the function. Two, the cognitive kind could rely on some kind of computation or mechanism that is stereotyped or copied. So N1 and N3 could perform the exact same computation that M relies on. Or the case I'm going to consider today is that the cognitive kind can actually be carried out by different non-redundant or non-stereotyped or non-identical structural elements. And this in neurobiology is called degeneracy. So I'm just going to argue briefly here that only degeneracy poses a real problem for our cognitive ontologies, but that the problem it poses is quite deep. So what if cognitive kinds map onto a distributed network of brain areas? Does this really challenge our ontology? Well, no, it just requires focusing on different structures. So if this kind of picture here, where the frontal parietal FPN network is involved in, say, attention, right? Then it's not that we need to revise our cognitive ontology and question whether attention should be a member. We just need to realize that it maps onto this network rather than any individual region. And if a cognitive kind relies on some computation or mechanical function, so maybe the attention is sometimes carried out by this area and sometimes this one, but these are exact stereotyped copies of each other, that really we just need to contextualize what structure does the function at a given time, but the function is still associated with the operation of the area. However, if it's the case, and I'll argue that it is the case, in fact, but if it's the case that a cognitive kind or a higher level function can be carried out by non-stereotyped structures, so you have parts of the brain that at some level are different from each other, but they can enact or carry out the same function, then I think this is a true problem, because it requires grappling with how it is that different structural elements with different features, different, say, mechanistic or computational properties, can do the same thing, and in what sense we mean that they do the same thing. So it requires grappling with similarity and difference in our ontology simultaneously. So now I'm going to turn to the claim that neural degeneracy is observed in the human brain at scales that are relevant to understanding human cognition. So here in this section, I'm going to claim that human and animal nervous systems exhibit this property of neural degeneracy, where different structural elements perform, in some sense, the same function, same higher level capacity in different contexts, but that some of these are not explained away by redundancy. So the two parts aren't just copies of each other, and they don't just perform some identical computation. And this is a famous paper that expresses the idea that degeneracy is important in human cognitive neuroscience, is this paper from Price and Friston, which argues that in some cases, brain areas A and B can subserve a particular higher level function, and in some other cases, brain areas A and C can do it, right? Okay. So degeneracy, as I mentioned, is the ability of elements that are structurally different to perform the same function or yield the same output. Unlike redundancy, which occurs when the same function is performed by identical elements, degeneracy is a prominent property of gene networks, neural networks, and evolution itself. Indeed, there's mounting evidence that degeneracy is a ubiquitous property of all biological systems at all levels of organization. And so there is a frequently recurring pattern going on where multiple, say genes can, involving multiple ion channels can, satisfy the same neural output. Then multiple neurons with different synaptic weights can exhibit the same circuit output, and multiple circuits with different network properties can kind of exhibit the same behavioral or system outputs under certain circumstances. So you have a very hierarchical scalar structure to this. Just as one example of this widely studied phenomenon in biology is the case of this crab stomatogastric ganglion, studied extensively by Eve Marder and colleagues. And the stomatogastric ganglion is part of the digestive system, part of the motor operation of the digestive system of crabs like Cancer borealis. And the crab stomatogastric ganglion produces a characteristic triphasic pyloric rhythm. So you can see these three different neurons each have a particular rhythmic output. So you get this triphasic rhythm of the pyloric portion of the SDG. And these are characterized by three neurons firing at a specific phase. But different crabs, crucially, or the same crab over its lifespan as it ages and changes, can have networks with very different ion channel and synaptic weight properties that give rise to, in some sense, the same rhythm, right? So there are multiple different configurations of structural elements like ion channels and synaptic weights that can give rise to, at the higher level, the same output or functional capacity. I'll revisit this point later in the talk, but degeneracy is studied in the context of robustness to internal and external perturbations, and is a broad feature of invertebrates and other neural systems that are well characterized. And some in other forms of degeneracy, it's not the case that you have kind of the same neurons hooked up differently, but you actually have different pools of neurons involved in the function. So in this literature, you'll also see cases where some escape behavior in a crustacean, like swimming away from something, can sometimes be subserved by one population of neurons and sometimes be subserved by another population. And even though they have at some level mechanically non-identical contributions, they suffice to perform the same function. So in cognitive neuroscience, if we're talking about human neuroscience, I will then characterize neural degeneracy as a disjunctive set of computationally or mechanically distinguishable or non-identical brain regions that can perform the same function in different contexts. So if we have a case where a cognitive function like reading can be carried out by region 1 or region 2, or if you have a case where working memory can be carried out by region 1 and 2 or 3, or a case where attention is carried out by regions 1 and 2, but also 3 or 4, right, then this would be a case of neural degeneracy in human cognitive neuroscience. And Price and Friston say on this that the ability of structurally different mechanisms to yield the same output is well appreciated in cognitive neuroscience. For example, and I'll come to this in more detail, but neuropsychological data indicate that familiar regular spell words can be read through 2 different routes, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so I just want to give a few examples of neural degeneracy in human cognitive neuroscience, where structurally different elements that are non-identical from a computational or mechanistic standpoint perform the same higher level function, kind of realize the same cognitive component or the same higher level cognitive capacity. And I will come back to these examples in the next section to illustrate why I think these will motivate taxonomic pluralism or pluralism about our cognitive ontologies. And you can ask me about any of the examples in more detail. So I'm giving a few of them to show that this is a ubiquitous phenomenon, but therefore I'll won't be able to go into exhaustive detail in any particular one. And here I'm also going to, and apologies to Javier, who thinks that working memory isn't a natural kind or possibly doesn't exist, or the models of it are bad, but I'm going to rely on a kind of classic model of working memory here. Okay, so working memory is a capacity to keep information presented to us in a short-term store for future use, and it's an active maintenance and manipulation of this information. Working memory is studied by things like the NBAC task, where here you're given a string of numbers and you're told to note when a number was presented 2 times back. And so you have to keep an ongoing register of what you have just seen in order to correctly indicate, that you just saw 7 in this 2 back iteration, or that you just saw 5 here because it is 1, 2 back, right? And an interesting thing about working memory is that a neurotypical individual can actually kind of use their capacity for working memory with different strategies that are carried out by different parts of the brain. And so a neurotypical individual who's given a string of numbers and no instructions about what to do with them except remember them, say in a 2-back task or a 3-back task, can actually accomplish this by different means. So one involves unconscious or conscious subvocalization or inner speech, and this is the operation of the phonological loop. And another is a visualization process where you're trying to visualize the string of words, and that's often been called, on these classic Baddeley style models of working memory, the visuospatial sketchpad. And so, working memory in the classic model is kind of a central executive process that's drawing upon information that's being fed either through this phonological loop via inner rehearsal, 1, 2, 3, 4, or this visuospatial sketchpad, which is a visual format depiction of the same information. And these are arguably these are carried out by different parts of the brain, and therefore, working memory is one of these disjoint or degenerate processes where you would have, let's say, the central executive and the episodic buffer, always involved. So, maybe areas 1 and 2 are always involved in any instantiation of working memory, but you now are disjunctive with whether it's the phonological loop or the visuospatial sketchpad. Another example of degeneracy, and this one is popular. It's the one that was mentioned by Price and Friston in their original article, comes from studying deficits, neuropsychological deficits that have informed cognitive models of simple word reading. And so very early cognitive models of reading, where you produced a particular phonology or sound based on a visual representation of a word, had just one pathway for articulating sounds that used some particular orthographic code or code for how to make sounds from written characters. But studying patient populations found interesting double dissociations in impairments in single word reading. So some patients had difficulty reading real words with exceptional phonological features like pint, while other patients with different deficits had trouble reading non-words with typical phonological features like poured, right, which obeys our phonology but is not a real word. And the studying these deficits carefully led to modeling 2 pathways from the written form of a word to its phonology. A sublexical pathway where the parts are read kind of in parallel. So you kind of go, you use rules that are grapheme to phoneme conversion rules that you run in parallel as you go from P to O to R to D, and a lexical root where you look up in a one-shot way the spelling from an orthographic lexicon that stores the word. And so the idea is that this lexical root is needed to understand these real words with exceptional features, whereas the sublexical, the non-lexical root is used to understand these non-words with typical features. And so damage to one or the other leaves one of these pathways impaired. And so in effect, there's two different ways. So this is kind of a single component in a cognitive model of reading, which is extracting phonology from visual word form, but it can be done through two different means that, as evidenced by neuropsychological damage, are in two different areas of the brain. And so this implies that at some level of description, the same components in the cognitive model can be carried out by different brain structures at different times. And there's been some recent work by Kathy Price and Seguier and colleagues that have found a ton of other really interesting examples of degeneracy in reading. And so I'll give just one example of a different component of reading. So Seguier et al. In 2012 found that so typically the parallel letter processing required for visual word recognition under rapid presentation. So if you are not allowed to use your kind of parallel processes because those take time and you're just shown a word in a brief flash, that quick parallel processing of visual word form usually involves a part of the brain called the left ventral occipital temporal cortex, or LVOT. And LVOT causes what's called pure alexia, or word blindness, in the majority of patients, where patients will not be able to recognize rapidly presented words as such, or may not be able to recognize, depending on the extent of the damage, words as such, and have extreme reading impairments. But what Seguier et al. Found in the first part of the study is that some patients with damage to LVOT are actually able to regain some reading capacity, particularly for short, familiar words rapidly presented, but that months post damage, say due to a stroke or a TBI, they can actually recover some of their reading abilities. And these researchers then ran some effective connectivity analyses, having studying the pattern of connectivity between brain regions, and actually found that there seemed to be strengthened connections between the superior temporal sulcus and other parts of the brain in patients who were recovering their ability to read. And so Seguier and colleagues hypothesized that there is this alternative route to rapid visual word presentation that is enacted not in the LVOT, but in STS instead. And in follow-up studies, they actually, follow-up experiments in the same study, they started looking at whether healthy individuals make use of the STS pathway as well, and found using functional this effective connectivity analyses they ran, that actually people to varying degrees, when they're healthy, use either the LVOT route or the STS route. So this is actually an interesting recurring theme that I'll talk about in a moment. And I'm going to give one more example here from kind of translational or clinical neuroscience, which is the neural bases of retaliation in conduct disorder. And this is research done by Soonjo Huang, who's in the medical school here at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Children with conduct disorder often exhibit deceitfulness, theft, aggression to people or animals, repeated rule violations and destruction of property. And White et al. In a 2016 study became interested in the neural basis of some behaviors that are key to conduct disorder, and in particular, the tendency to retaliate when provoked. And so White et al. Used a ultimatum game where proposers can offer you either a fair or unfair split in money, and you can accept or reject it. And in a case where retaliation, so rejecting an offer where you all get nothing, can actually be maladaptive or hurt you in terms of the amount of overall money that you receive. And so White et al. We're studying two different populations of two different potential populations of children with conduct disorder, those with callous unemotional traits, so those who also have low levels of kind of empathy, emotional empathy, and reactivity to others' emotional states, and children without these callous unemotional traits, children who have these rule violations and this propensity to retaliate. And so they found that this population as a whole was very reactive and retaliatory in an ultimatum game. So the whole population retaliated, but they found that this behavior, this propensity to retaliate, was actually perhaps carried out by different neural circuits. So in particular, they found that in children who did not have these callous unemotional traits, emotional brain areas like the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray were kind of hyperactive and may underlie a propensity to retaliate. But these activation in these particular areas are no different in children with callous unemotional traits, which suggests that kind of desire to retaliate can be kind of either hot or cold. And this has therapeutic implications because children with conduct disorder and also callous unemotional traits may not benefit from interventions that would reduce emotional responsiveness. So I'll come back in a little bit and explain a little further more why I think these examples motivate taxonomic pluralism. But first, I just want to say that there's a general and really interesting picture of what's going on with neural degeneracy that's emerging from this research. And I could have chosen many other examples. There's research on the neural basis of impulsivity, suggesting that there are different ways of being impulsive, different sets of regions and different patterns of activation between them that can underlie impulsivity. And this has also been studied with other cognitive control elements extensively by the lab of Todd Braver at WashU. And so the basic picture emerging, and this comes partly from some discussions by email with Kathy Price, who's one of my intellectual heroes. But the idea here is that different disjunctive sets of brain areas can be used to perform the same higher level cognitive capacity, whether we're talking about word reading, working memory, the propensity to retaliate against someone, all these different cases, and that this can occur knowingly with the use of different cognitive strategies. So we often have a choice of how we solve different problems, and therefore we can kind of use different networks of our brain, in order to complete the same tasks. But it can also occur frequently, and this is, for example, the example of the STS as an alternate pathway to reading visually presented words. This can also occur unknowingly. So people, unbeknownst to them, seem to use different regions or pathways to accomplish the same tasks at different times and not even know that they're doing it. So, it could be that you sometimes read the words on the screen with, the LOVT, and you sometimes read the words on the screen with the STS, and, which there are individual differences in which of these you are more inclined to do. And Price likens this to handedness. Some people find it more natural to pick things up with the right hand, some more natural to the left. But in any case, it can also be modulated, not just by your individual strengths, but also task difficulty or prompts. So it can be that, there's a certain part of your brain that you kind of use to perform a task if it's easy, but as it gets harder, you need to shift over to different resources. And I'll also mention, and here also repping recent work by Zena Ward and Marco Viola on individual differences, that, the regions, can be different between different individuals. So, individual differences is a strong place to look for kind of degeneracy, but also also obviously the regions used can change after injury and can be altered over the lifespan, which is also explored in a paper by Felipe de Brigard in 2017. Okay, so I'm going to argue that degeneracy, or these different structural elements that are non-identical, that this picture necessitates or motivates developing plural ontologies. when we're doing cognitive ontology development. That because we can have different coalitions of brain areas in a disjunctive way that carry out, in some sense, the same higher level function, that we should actually have ontologies that both lump them together and kind of express the common function in some circumstances, but also split them in other cases respecting their differences. And I'm going to say that the similarities and differences between these coalitions of regions that come together to perform some higher level capacity, they matter for some purposes of cognitive modeling and and psychotherapy, but they don't matter for others. And this is why we need plural ontologies. I'll say here quickly that there have been recent calls for taxonomic pluralism in the philosophy of science in general, and also in the mental domain. So David Danks says, the world does not come to us carved up into its constituent objects, and we can segment the world through our scientific theories in different incompatible ways depending on our goals and purposes. Therefore, the pursuit of a unified scientific ontology is fundamentally misguided. And on that same note, in a paper called Categorizing the Mental, Eric Hochstein says, argue that the assumption that there's a single ideally correct way of classifying or categorizing mental phenomena, that neuroscience and psychology should adhere to this correct scheme, runs counter to productive scientific practices. Such a view ignores or glosses over the plurality of aims and goals that neuroscientists and psychologists have in studying mental phenomena. So the best classificatory scheme to use for some of these goals will not be the same as the best one suited for others. And so this is just a visual depiction of what I'm going to argue using the examples I've already presented. So Danks says we can segment the world through our science, our ontologies according to our purposes. And so I'm going to claim that we want, from things like the Cognitive Atlas, a taxonomy that sometimes lumps together items together and sometimes splits them. And this is, in some sense, positing incompatible relations between items, but this may be the best way to do taxonomy, right? So if working memory is, as a whole, worth including in our taxonomy, but working memory also, we should sometimes note that it can be carried out via the visual spatial sketchpad and sometimes carried out via the phonological loop, then our ontology should actually be able to flexibly switch between conceiving of working memory as an item and working memory as two items. So this is what I'm going to argue from the examples I just presented. Okay, so I talked about how working memory is, in some sense, accomplishing the same task. It's using the coalition of brain areas we're given in order to memorize things like a string of 7 numbers presented to us, right? But we can do this via different means, say the visual spatial sketchpad or the phonological loop. So is working memory one kind of thing? Or, owing to the fact that it can be carried out disjunctively by different neural mechanisms, should we split it into 2 cognitive kinds? Well, I think that if we just look at cognitive modeling, right, for some purposes, so let's say we're studying whether working memory impairments generally affect task switching. Do working memory impairments affect the ability to do something like the trail making task where you switch rules for connecting the dots from 0 to 1 and then A to B, right? Due to working memory deficits impair that. Well, likely, it doesn't matter, right? So whether as a whole, the population you're studying tends to use the visuospatial loop or the the visuospatial sketchpad or the phonological loop might not matter for, that connection between cognitive processes. But for other purposes of investigation, it might matter very much. For example, there are tasks like verbal word repetition. So if you're asked to do something like an NBAC task, but you're also rehearsing words to yourself or somebody's playing distracting sounds, that can selectively interfere with the phonological loop. And so if you were interested in whether working memory as a whole affects task switching, you might consider working memory as a unit. But if you're interested in whether verbal word repetition impairs working memory, right, then you really need to make this distinction. All right. Similarly, I would argue that something similar could be said of reading. So, should we consider the lexical and sublexical roots? When you are looking at a word like pint or kernel, right, when you then look up the lexicon from the whole visual form rapidly processed, or the sublexical root where you go in parallel for an unfamiliar word like vint, right? Is that one cognitive component or multiple? Well, on one hand, in some sense they carry out the same cognitive component of reading, and for many tasks it just might not matter which of these people are doing at what time, right? And so let's say let's say you're studying memory, and you want to know if there's some effect of you're doing a kind of DRM paradigm, and you want to know if presenting words earlier kind of affects if there are semantic effects, for example, when people are asked to judge whether a bunch of words whether they've seen a bunch of words before in a kind of familiarity sort of paradigm, right? So it might not matter how people are reading single words for that purpose. But of course, if you're studying patient populations who have brain damage and some reading deficits, then it absolutely matters that we read words via these different routes, right? So again, the different purposes that we have may determine whether we consider this kind of one item in ontology or multiple. And I argue that the same thing is going on in this case of the translational neuroscience of retaliation in conduct disorder. So recall that there are children with callous unemotional traits and children without callous unemotional traits, but nonetheless they share in being part of the patient population of conduct disorder, and they share this propensity to retaliate even when it's maladaptive, so even when it loses them money, and so even when there are negative consequences. So White et al., you might think that from their paper that found that in children without callous unemotional traits, that the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray were more active, that we just have two completely distinct patient populations, and we should just split the kind of conduct disorder into these two flavors. But that's actually not what White et al. Say for the following reason. So while they found that sort of the motivation perhaps to retaliate might differ between these individuals and might involve differential threat responses in the amygdala, they also found that everyone in their population group has this behavior to keep retaliating even when it's maladaptive or even when it has negative consequences for them, and that compared to controls, they have some of the same alterations in the activity and the connectivity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this actually fits with the broader literature in moral psychology and in psychiatry that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is actually required to kind of incorporate negative feedback from performing understand the negative consequences of actions that you perform. And so it's important for kind of moral reinforcement learning, if that's an acceptable paraphrase for that. And so, they don't recommend, splitting this patient population. So, on one hand, while if you're going to give them therapy to reduce their emotions, that will be effective if you're not callous unemotional, and completely pointless if you're callous unemotional. So there are different therapeutic targets depending on the route to punishment. But at the same time, there seems to be a shared mechanism that's really core to conduct disorder of not appreciating the negative consequences of continuing to aggress or retaliate involving the VMPFC. And so again, we have some clinical purposes for which you might want to lump, and some for which you might want to split. I do want to briefly note that the argument I just gave is not really complete in this following sense. So it could be that major depressive disorder and anxiety, and in fact it is true, both benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy, so that there's some common therapeutic target. That doesn't mean that our ontology should really ever lump major depressive disorder and, say, generalized anxiety disorder together merely on that basis. But I take White et al. To be making a stronger claim here. I take their claim to be that perhaps this inability to kind of appreciate the negative consequences of their continued aggression, even though it's harming them, is actually kind of the core deficit that sort of unites individuals who have this conduct disorder, and that the emotional traits are kind of more a kind of sub-feature or a sub-phenotype of some sort. Okay. So I've been arguing that when we're building cognitive ontologies, that we want to endorse a form of taxonomic pluralism, where sometimes we consider the route from orthography to phonology as one component of reading, but other times we want to split into the sublexical route that uses grapheme phoneme conversion rules, and the lexical route that uses the lexicon from the whole word representation. And in this case, we would sometimes lump and sometimes split when developing ontologies. And there's then some entries like in the general route from orthography to phonology or working memory or retaliation behavior that are not going to map onto a single neural mechanism because of this disjunctive functional arrangement. And so someone could come along and say, well, hey, why don't we just be dedicated kind of Poldrakians and indefinitely split our cognitive ontologies whenever the same higher level function or capacity can be carried out by different neural structures in different contexts? So why don't we go to the working memory entry in the cognitive atlas and replace it with the exercise of the episodic buffer, the central executive, and have the visuospatial version and the phonological loop version? Why is that a move that we should resist? So I want to do a little bit to forestall this kind of objection. Well, the first is riffing on Jackie Sullivan's notion of the benefits of coordinated pluralism. And so here I just want to mention that databases like the Cognitive Atlas, we all acknowledge, are living documents. I mean, they're the science of the mind and brain is fairly young, and so these are in some ways supposed to be databases that aid ongoing research efforts rather than a true attempt to have a final kind of periodic table of the mind. And so they have a heuristic purpose to aid ongoing investigations into the nature of healthy and disordered cognition. And Sullivan in 2017, in a wonderful paper that examines initiatives like the Cognitive Atlas, but also initiatives in psychiatry like the Centrix Project and RDoC that are trying to understand cognitive deficits in different mental disorders, argues that coordinated pluralism, so deliberately studying a phenomenon that is, so if you have a phenomenon that we do not fully understand, that actually different kind of lines of investigation that conceptualize that phenomenon in different ways, so say different ways of conceiving of impulsivity or different ways of conceiving of reactive aggression, can actually foster progress in the mind-brain sciences, where self-defeating pluralism, like where you just say you're studying working memory, but actually you might be studying, in some cases, the phonological loop, and in some cases, the visuospatial sketchpad, is kind of self-defeating. So we need to be aware of the structure of our plural taxonomies in order to avoid a kind of self-defeating pluralism where we're actually just talking past each other effectively. And so another point that I think kind of comes out of reading a few of Sullivan's papers is that stipulating that we just must lump or split kinds when dealing with degeneracy kind of runs the risk of failing to investigate theoretically or therapeutically interesting similarities or differences. And so there's a plug for the idea that we should, that it'll be helpful in developing ontologies to keep track of differences as well as keeping track of similarities, which arguably documents like this do, but not as well as they could. Okay, but I anticipate that someone might say, well, but yeah, I'm not really interested in whether we should be pluralists now. I want to know whether we could ever expunge this pluralism and have like a truly mechanistic picture of the mind where every item in our cognitive ontology maps onto some particular neural mechanism. And here I want to point out that arch mechanist Carl Craver has actually argued in a 2009 paper called Mechanisms and Natural Kinds that this strategy is actually unlikely to work. And so what Craver says is that when we're thinking about lumping and splitting kinds in the mind-brain sciences, so is memory one thing or many? Of course, it's many. But that when we answer questions like that, our choice of lumping and splitting is often guided by pointing toward whether the kind is undergirded by the same mechanism or not. So that if we find out that there's a distinct brain mechanism for implicit memory as opposed to declarative memory, then we'll split the kind. And if we find out that there's a different brain mechanism for the different components of reading, then we would just split them up as well. Craver raises a problem in this paper that I think is really interesting, arguing that there's no guide to how we type mechanisms, right? That in some sense, the question of whether two mechanisms that we would be dealing with in the brain are of the same kind or not is just as vexing as the question of whether the kinds are the same, right? So we kind of want the mechanisms to fix the kinds, but that would require us to have an answer to when two mechanisms really are and are not the same mechanism. And the reason this becomes problematic, and this is really what's at stake in this issue of degeneracy, is that humans And other animals, their nervous systems just exhibit complexity where there's individual variation, but similarity at some higher level. And so Craver asks us to think about the question of whether, so maybe we've split episodic memory, which is, involving hippocampal systems, off from implicit memory, which involves, basal ganglia systems. And here we have, these, memories that have a where and a when associated with them. And here we just have kind of procedural, non-episodic memories, right? And we say, okay, great. Well, but what if we asked, is episodic memory, a single cognitive kind? And, then we might ask, well, do individuals who vary in the systems for episodic memory have the same capacity or not? And so, Craver, considers the extensive individual variation. And this is just some of the morphological variation in the human hippocampus. So these are just, 4 people and the 4 different shapes and connectivity styles of their hippocampi that must have at some level differences in the ability to encode information into episodes, right? And so, some people get lost in parking lots for hours, and some people don't, right? And so Craver argues provocatively here that characterizing a mechanism very abstractly, potentially glosses over some kinds of mechanisms. So if we just say, kind of by fiat, all human beings have the same kind of episodic memory, we might miss the fact that London cab drivers might have a very different kind of episodic memory than me when we're driving, right? But on the other hand, splitting kinds of the mechanisms differ in any of the myriad ways the 2 mechanisms might differ, in the precise features of their component entities, activities, and organizations. Then there would be as many kinds of declarative memory encoding as there are individual hippocampi, right? So we would kind of go in the alternate extreme and say that every human being has a unique psychological kind in regard to their episodic memory. I will also mention, and this is an example that I think is very faithful to Craver's point here, which is that when we are doing neural modeling, the purposes to which we are putting the models and the contexts might really determine whether we care about subtle mechanistic differences between individual members. And so Craver says, as a general point in this paper, that mechanisms that produce the same effects with different components, again, you're kind of hearing that degeneracy language, should be lumped on the basis of their effects and split on the basis of their constitutive mechanisms, right? So they should be lumped together and that they all produce, in, say, the case of the crab Stomatogastric ganglion, the triphasic pyloric rhythm, but they should be split in the sense that they are constituted, right, by different concentrations of ion channels and different synaptic weights. And so here I want to mention that, the whole point of studying the S2G and why it's interesting has often been considered the similarity, right? That networks, that there are thousands or, hundreds of thousands of networks with different configurations that give rise to the same output the animal needs in order to live, and that this can, operate under a wide range of temperatures and other environmental conditions, neuromodulatory regimes and things like that, has been part of the whole interest in studying this, right? So, we want to say that at some level, these different neural systems, produce the same outputs. However, there are other contexts for which the subtle differences between these networks matter a great deal. And so if you take, say 4 different crabs with 4 different STGs, submit them to kind of minor perturbations in temperature, they might all have roughly the same conserved output. But if you do a critical perturbation, so really high or really low temperature regimes, some of them may kind of keep enough of a triphasic rhythm going for the animal to survive and keep doing what it's doing, whereas others might crash, right? And so for some, so whether these networks really perform the same function actually depends on, what context and what modeling systems we are interested in. Okay. So I'm going to briefly conclude. And so my first claim here is just that no matter how you resolve the only split issue, degeneracy in cognitive neuroscience will require cognitive ontology revision. And I favor plural taxonomies in cases of neural degeneracy. And I think this will be more like having kind of an atlas of the mind, like a road atlas of the mind, rather than one cartographic map of the mind. And so that's the note that I'll end on. But I'll first say that, so no matter how we resolve this issue of whether we should, always split or sometimes lump and sometimes split kind of higher level capacities like reading or cognitive components like orthography, our ontologies should respect the neural and functional differences in the way that these bits of cognition can be carried out. and thus the ontology as it stands might need massive revision, either in the form of splitting or in the form of sometimes lumping and sometimes splitting, right? So our cognitive ontology, currently contains in the atlas, concepts like reading, concepts like visual word recognition and orthography, which are kind of components of reading, right? But each of these things are degenerately carried out, right? And so we actually looked at how what's being called orthography here is carried out by, the lexical and sublexical roots. I showed you a case where actually just rapid visual word recognition can be carried out by different roots, either the LOTV or the STS. And then even more interestingly, if we consider reading to be some, yet higher level kind, that means reading can be kind of multiply degenerately carried out, right? So in theory, you could, recognize the visual word form with the STS, but then do orthography through the sublexical root, or you could, read through the LOTV, but then do the lexical root for orthography, right? And so the kind of higher level capacities are more kind of multiply degenerate, right? So I think that this form of degeneracy necessitates pluralism. I think the most natural way to approach this set of problems is with ontologies that respect higher level cognitive capacities like reading and their components like visual word recognition, but also recognize that lower level functional assemblages coalesce to realize these functions. And just summarizing what I've already said, I believe that the kind reading has predictive and causal reality. So I think that it is something we care about as a phenomenon, but also that even though reading is kind of multiply carried out by all these different subfunctions, that it can also be a causally separable and manipulatable component in some yet higher level task. And so I think that we should kind of have an ontology that respects the roots through which they come about. Briefly, I wanted to mention that Trey Boone, a great philosopher of cognitive neuroscience, is doing some really interesting work on the degeneracy concept and arguing that we should understand sameness and difference of function at these different levels in terms of claims about causal invariance. And so that is an interesting route through which maybe we can talk about the metaphysical reality of the higher level kinds beyond sort of the utility for cognitive modeling that I've been pointing out. So more of a metaphysical rather than a pragmatic turn kind of note. And so what we might have, if my picture that I presented today is right, so we have these structures like the cognitive atlas that aspire to be as systematic a depiction as they can of our cognitive kinds. But maybe a cognitive ontology is, as a database, kind of less like one giant map that charts the entire domain in a single representation, and more like a road atlas or a collection of maps that are suited for different purposes. So if you're driving through the great state of Oregon, which I really hope I will again someday, if you want to know where the roads are and how to get to the wineries in Dundee fast, you might pull out the part of the atlas that shows you the highways, right? But if you're interested in knowing where there might be interesting off-road rock climbing or somewhere beautiful to camp, you might then pull out a topographic map, right? And so there's no maybe there's a slight disanalogy because hopefully these maps aren't incompatible in any way, whereas the taxonomies, if we lump sometimes and split sometimes, might be in some sense representationally compatible. But nevertheless, I think we might want more of an atlas of the mind than a unified map, and that neural degeneracy requires us to embrace taxonomic pluralism. I want to end by just again thanking Adina Roskies for inviting me to the conference, and Edward Mashri, Alexander McGee, Morgan Thompson, Trey Boone, and many others for organizing the event. Apologies if I missed anyone. And I want to thank a number of people for great thoughts and conversations, including Jesse Wright, Felipe de Brigard, Walter Stone Armstrong, all the attendees of SNAP 2019, Kathy Price, Trey Boone, Marco Viola, Carl Craver, Jackie Sullivan, Eric Hochstein, David Danks, Colin Klein, Michael Anderson, Joe Dewhurst, Dan Bernstein, Kevin Ryan, Sunjo Huang, Evan Westra, and many others. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Joe, for this amazing talk. Let me remind the audience how we're going to be proceeding. We're using Zoom webinars, so you can't ask directly a question to Joe. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just write your name, and I will promote you to the panelist status, and then you can ask a question to Joe directly and talk to him in person. We already have 2 people in the queue, but Adina had a question. And Adina, why don't you start while I'm actually promoting people?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting, Joe. I felt almost convinced, and then sort of in your last slide, you sort of undergirded my uneasiness, which is, what happens when these things are incompatible? And in fact, I think the problem is still more worrisome than just having different incompatible taxonomies, because unlike in the case of maps, where we feel pretty comfortable with the existence of the objects of our ontology already, what we're trying to do in neuroscience is figure out whether these ontologies that we're positing are actually corresponding to anything that could be explanatory. And so it's not really a question of what level of this sort of reductionistic hierarchy we want to work at. I agree that there are cases to lump and there are cases to split, but the question is really, are we even picking out something that can be fruitfully, examined as a phenomenon? And there, I think, I'm not sure that we're getting any tools to get purchase on this question, right? The underlying question isn't really what level do we want to be at, but whether there's any there, what the things that we're picking out at some high level, whether they correspond to any kind of theoretical object at all. And so I guess I wanted you to give me your thoughts about that question.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I feel the force of the worry myself. I'm sort of not naturally, in my inclination, someone who embraces sort of like taxonomic pluralism, and I myself kind of want to discharge pluralism where possible, and maybe these are just points where I kind of feel like I quite can't yet. Let me say a couple things about, so I think there's 2 distinct issues that are worth mentioning here, and that I think are both really difficult to think about and need a bit more conceptual precision and a little further work. And so I want to go to one of my my secret slide really quickly. So one of the things I'm interested in is whether, so I mentioned that a case where you could actually use different cognitive strategies to solve the same kind of high level, well-defined task could sort of count as neural degeneracy if you just define it as different structural elements carrying out what we in some way, kind of at some level of granularity in Bechtel and Mundale's way of talking, can call the same function. And I think there might be something illegitimate about lumping kind of any kind of cognitive strategy together with other potential cases of degeneracy. So that's one thing to say, is I think we might need to distinguish between different kinds of degeneracy that either have higher or lower degrees of freedom. And I'll just briefly outline sort of what I mean by that. But so I think there are some, so at issue here in some ways is whether, 2 different structures can, satisfy the same higher level capacity, but also whether they're, kind of what Craver would call a mechanistic role contribution to that capacity is the same or not. And I think in some cases, those things, the higher level capacity itself is quite constrained in the sorts of mechanisms that could get the job done. But I think in other cases, there are many more degrees of freedom. So if you think about something like, a human heart maybe and a mechanical heart can, possibly both, suffice for circulation. But it's interesting that mechanical hearts look so darn much like biological hearts. And I think this is partly because, there are some pretty severe constraints on blood pressure, but also sort of the timing of the time course of circulation and how blood perfuses. And so here I would say that, there are possibly, degenerate ways to accomplish this task, but they're very, very constrained. So any mechanism that can kind of get this job done has to really resemble the original one. Whereas if you just think of something like swatting a spider, you know, it has many degrees of freedom. So you could, you know, kill the spider with your sandal, and you could whap it with a newspaper, or, you know, you could be like the arachnophobia guy and pull out your flamethrower, right? And so I sometimes worry about, you know, maybe neural degeneracy, if you have, maybe the spider case would be more analogous to some, you know, high level kind of cognitive function, but that could really be realized by a ton of different strategies and, you know, mechanisms throughout the brain, whereas some of the functions we're talking about might be much more tightly constrained. And so I kind of worry about this concept of umbrellaing over both of these, partly because I think that I think almost every theorist from Gall to Russ Poldrack has been actually kind of worried about having things that have so many degrees of freedom being kind of part of our cognitive ontology, right? So anyway, it gets a bit rambly, but like Franz Gall, actually, like people wrote him and said, like, hey, you know, you have like spatial relations and color and all these things as components of painting, but why isn't painting a faculty, right? And in trying to, you know, answer that, you know, he says things kind of like, well, you know, the genuine faculties are more, we all have them operating in the same way, et cetera. Whereas painting is this thing that's kind of cobbled together from the faculties in a way that's not the same from person to person, and therefore we don't recognize it as kind of foundational. I think degeneracy of even basic cognitive components like reading, I think, you know, sort of makes this kind of line problematic or blurs it a bit. So anyway, yeah, I'll just say I think there needs to be a little more clarity about you know, what we mean by degeneracy. And I think that the alternative route to go, if you kind of didn't like my picture, would be something like a cognitive ontology having this massive path diagram kind of structure to it. So if you know, maybe every relation, so I mean, working memory itself can't necessarily interact with task switching, right? So it's some exercise or some sub way of doing working memory. So maybe you could deal with degeneracy by having like a complicated path structure where it's kind of like the ways that the components interact are dependent on what subfunctions can carry them out. So yeah, that's kind of, I think there's a lot more work to be done on that question, but those are the lines along which I'm thinking.
Thanks, Joe and Adina. Joe, if I could invite you, if you don't need it, to move back to the to turn off the presentation mode so that we can see each other a bit better.
Oh, sure.
And we are supposed to stop in 15 minutes, and there's actually 4 people, so keep that in mind, all of you, when you're asking and responding to questions. And you're the next one.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe, for the presentation. My name's Ann Vroom. I'm located in Washington, D.C. My question is calling for some speculation on your part to sort of pull this together. Do you have any early days thoughts about who is the decider in pursuing various ontological routes that may be mapped to specific activities? What is the, you know, the meta level mechanism going on there? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Actually, in my paper with Jesse, we go into it a little tiny bit. So actually, Jesse thinks that efforts like the Cognitive Atlas, which Russ Poldrack constructed, having kind of a firm grounding in kind of classical cognitive psychology, are somehow an exercise of authority about what scientifically legitimate frameworks for studying the mind look like. And so, you know, if you go, there are probably, you know, concepts from embodied cognition, which aren't in, you know, embodied approaches that probably aren't in the Atlas, or there are, you know, concepts derived from, you know, non-Western, you know, frameworks, different notions of consciousness or things like that. And so, yeah, I think that probably any attempt to taxonomize mental kinds presumes not just some relation between concepts and neural mechanisms, but also some pretty deep theoretical commitments about what minds are. And this is something Michael Anderson also talks about in his 2015 paper. So yeah, that's all I'll say there, is that it's probably it's a meta question. All of this talk was kind of presuming that the concepts of cognitive psychology and the methods we have for doing cognitive neuroscience are kind of a good starting point, and you can kind of elaborate from there. But if this was just somehow the wrong way to think about the mind, if something like, you know, Adina Roski's gave a talk arguing that, you know, predictive coding framework might be kind of a unified framework for understanding the mind, if something like that is true, then this just wouldn't be the right way to construct and assess ontologies. You'd need some different starting point. So,
Okay, thank you.
Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Joe, for the talk. As you might imagine, I'm on the same line yet again. And well, I want, rather than posing a specific question, I'd like to underline, to highlight a couple of benefits that neuroscience practitioners will gain by taking deep care of the things you're explaining here. That is, first, in task analysis, whenever you know that a single task can be multiple realized, I'm saying it with a bit of scare because lots of metaphysics there, but say whenever a task can be exploited in dual root, then a neuroscientist should pay much more care to be sure that she or he is studying the road she or he is interested in, unless she or he is willing to let the subject decide. That is, she must be aware that there are multiple routes and she is deciding but otherwise, if there is only one route she want to investigate, knowing and appreciating that most tasks can be multiply realized, that will be important to ameliorate the task analysis. But the second part is probably the most intriguing one. If you let neuroscientists appreciate better the extent of degeneracy, you can pose brand new and fascinating questions. I'm pretty sure that Edward here will be much interested because some of these are inspired by his commentary 10 years ago on the weirdest people of the world papers. I mean, sometimes people in different cultures behave differently in the face of a same task, not because they do not have access to the second route, but just because their culture bias them toward using a route that for other people will be secondary. Okay, so it will be very cool to have a taxonomy for each task, however you conceive it, for which is the favorite route and the second best and third best routes. And then most obviously, why is some route the first best route for these people and the second best route for these people under these task demands? Now, this is a kind of question that I'm looking forward to see in neuroscience. That'll be extremely exciting to me and possibly even fruitful. I'd like to have your opinion on this, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And, I had mainly been, when I was thinking about the choice of different routes, I was mainly thinking of some, documented individual differences. So, for example, it turns out to be, aphantasia or lacking mental imagery. So there's a lot of variation in mental imagery, and even a virtual lack of it seems to be pretty common. And so there's probably some cases where just individual differences, really bias what routes people want to use to complete tasks. So some people probably rely on mental imagery a lot, and some people probably don't unless they're really prompted. I wasn't aware that there are well-documented cultural kind of differences in when people are given a cognitive task with, a prompt to just do it and no further instruction, that there are cultural differences in how people naturally carry it out. I think that's awesome. So yeah, and the other thought is that I think part of the way that, so Anderson's 2015 book, After Phrenology, kind of supposes not just that there are, some tasks that can be done with one or two routes, but really that brain areas can often kind of sub in and do a slightly worse job at something. And I think that's also a picture that I don't know the extent to which we ultimately will go, kind of Anderson 2015 or Hutto, who talks about protean brains, where every area can do all the functions but differs in the strength of them, and we kind of assemble these coalitions on the fly rather than kind of stably, as I showed them. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to ponder about these multiple routes or means through which we complete cognitive tasks. And I think one that has been pretty well studied by people like Todd Braver is also the role that difficulty can play in this. So I think actually your picture would maybe even have to be one wrinkle more complicated too, because there are cases Braver's looked at where there's a brain system that is kind of it's sort of like there's a brain system you use to do, say, a cognitive control task when it's easy, but if it gets hard enough, you have to recruit an additional region, say on the other side, or a completely separate region. And so things like task difficulty may even modulate the routes that people either are inclined to use or have to use. So yeah, I think it's a very rich way of thinking about these things. But yeah, thanks so much for the cultural differences comment. I want to talk to you more about that. That's really fascinating.
Thanks, Marco. Philippe, floor is yours.
Hi, Joe. Nice to see you. Thanks for the presentation. It's been a while and good to see you talking. I have a question about whether we need a more substantial notion of function in this debate. So I know that you, at least in your previous papers, have adopted the causal role view, so have I. But I've been, for instance, yelled at by philosophers of neuroscience for like, well, this debate doesn't make sense because like, we don't know whether these are the right functions, right? So do we need, for instance, a more evolutionary based account of function? Or I think Altiero Piccinini also has a stronger sort of more objective kind of theory of function. Do you think that would help in these debates? Or do you think that, I don't know, the problems reoccur in other ways?
Yeah, I tend to be I've tended to think of things in terms of a kind of hierarchy of mechanistic role functions. I think that probably came out in this talk as well. I ultimately think that I worry about this a lot, right? So I sort of worry that degeneracy as it was defined by Edelman and Galley and Price and Friston in this talk, a function can be like a component of a cognitive task, what we call a cognitive task. It can be a cognitive task. It can be a naturalistic whole human behavior. So yeah, I do worry about the same analysis kind of being stretched to apply to all of these different things. So yeah, I do think that ultimately we might want to be careful about, one of the difficulties is maybe this is a direction Dan Bernstein is starting to go, right? And so there's kind of this presumption in cognitive science that, how would I put it? That faculties ultimately kind of fix function rather than tasks because the mind is in some sense atomistic, right? So I think it is I think there's kind of a deep faculty psychology intuition underlying a lot of cognitive neuroscience, which says, well, we don't really fix functions to tasks we perform, like the NBAC task. Functions are fixed by things like working memory, which are the atomic, kind of isolable, components that are combined and recombined in tasks. And yeah, to that question, I would say that maybe that is a kind of unexamined or not fully examined function. So I think some people like Joe Dewhurst, Dan Bernstein, certainly Hutto, certainly Anderson are maybe starting to think that, tasks themselves, that, tasks are maybe the unit to which this should be indexed, and that there are in fact no kind of strictly combinable or recombinable elementary functions. I think that's probably a corollary of Anderson's 2015 book. In terms of evolutionary functions, I personally think that something like Bergeron style evolved functions, or perhaps even like Garson style selected effect type functions through development, are part of the functional story in neuroscience. But I think that crosscuts this kind of question about function. So I tend to think that the question of how a brain area came to have the structural features it has, or how it came to be involved in the sensory inputs it's involved in, or the tasks it's involved in, is kind of separate from the contribution that area makes. So I've always kind of kept those things separate, but I think they're both part of the story. So anyway, sorry if that was a bit of a rambly response. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, it's a really great question.
Thanks, Philippe. I'll take the advantage of moderating the discussion to ask a question, which I believe was related to the one Adina started with, but with a slightly different slant. When I was listening to you, I was in some ways a bit disturbed by the type of psychological constructs you were looking at. And I felt, for some of them, we know they're valid, and it's really interesting that they map onto different brain structures. For others, we don't know they're valid. For others, we are definitively skeptical that they are valid. You took the example of the propensity for aggression. Well, that's surely not going to be part of any good psychological science. And it's definitely not very surprising that that map onto many different psychological structures. And as you know, there's been a very long-standing debate about the validity of any psychiatric categories. So finding that those map onto different brain structures or genetic network or what have you is just not very surprising either. It just does not say very much. It says something about the validity of this psychological or psychiatric constructs. By contrast, working memory, bracketing some of the debate, one might think it's a much better position to be at least a well-validated psychological construct. So I'm a little bit hesitant to somehow look at the whole body of literature you discuss in great detail and with a lot of insights to say, well, the conclusion you want to draw from the facts the science you're discussing seems to vary depending on the validity of a psychological construct. And I'm very reluctant to treat all of them similarly, really. So I wanted to see whether you have any thought with respect to that question. I think it's quite a follow-up to the question that Dina asked earlier.
Yeah, good. It's another place the research program needs to go. I completely agree with you. So I mean, conduct disorder is probably in the world of psychiatry, a kind of dodgy construct. People have worried that it's racist, effectively in its construction, propensity to punish as some kind of RDoC matrix, attempt to get a better grip on things like that, or things that are called, antisocial personality disorders. So yeah, I completely agree. I do think, so I do want to, yeah, I actually agree. I think that's destructive to the account that it could be that, some of these are, the ones that are well validated are also these highly stereotyped things that we do, like word reading, which you're doing every single day and being trained in. I think I will mention just a couple things related to just what kinds of examples might be best and how you would find them. So part of the reason Kathy Price's body of work on reading has been so powerful and good as a set of examples about this is because it really involves combining careful neuropsychology with sophisticated neuroimaging. And so it's, I think, a kind of research program that not all that many labs are really able to kind of carry out, right? So what it took to show that the LOVT or LO, yeah, and the STS can both underlie this rapid word presentation was, a body of work that involved like analyzing a big cohort of stroke patients, finding a subpopulation that recovered some function, then using sophisticated like connectivity modeling techniques in healthy populations to see whether that same pathway existed in healthy neurotypical individuals. And so I don't know, I think there's actually something, I don't think it's easy to do some of the form, because that's sort of Price has a recurring kind of paradigm, which is sort of like isolate that the task could be done differently via neuropsychology, study that it can be done in a dual root way by healthy individuals. And I don't know, I think there's a combination of not many people kind of applying that framework, and also it being difficult and you having to kind of combine neuropsychology and fMRI in ways that are sophisticated and not well done. But I will say that there are other, the cognitive control kind of broadly construed is one of the places to find other good examples of things. I mean, I kind of agree that being impulsive is probably not a wonderful exemplar of a psychologically valid kind, but yet there's a pretty big body of literature on similar kind of Price-like effects in the domain of cognitive control regarding things like whether not initiating and stopping are the same, and whether, having kind of overwhelming urges and suppressing them. So I think there's actually some good multiple routes to kind of cognitive control and impulse control. And that might be the other best example I could find. But yeah, the point's well taken.
Thanks, that's helpful. And I think Adina will have the last word. Go for it, Adina.
Yeah, hi. So I guess, Edouard, had asked sort of a similar question. I guess I wanted to ask a more pointed question about the conduct disorder example. I mean, it seemed to me that what you were looking at there, rather than being an example of degeneracy, was more an example of a unique subservience of function by structure, if what you said at the end regarding the commonality in the VM pathway is correct, right? So you might think that the amygdala, the emotional areas that were seen to be different are just inputs into a brain area that's doing a common kind of computation. And so I also found that, that choice of example to be maybe not the most illustrative of the kind of thing you were trying to talk about. So, I mean, I may have missed something also about how those were supposed to illustrate the degeneracy, but it seemed to me they did the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's ultimately right. I've been kind of looking at a wing of that literature where there's a kind of model of the components of this propensity to retaliate. And I think that the authors of this paper were trying to suggest that even though this one component, which is kind of why you want to retaliate, is different, that the kind of rest of the shape of the model is similar. And so I think, but whether that's in fact the right way to think about this stuff, given that this is such a diffuse and maybe ill-defined behavioral output in the first place, yeah, maybe it's just not. So yeah, I'll have to think more about that. I think that, let's see, I don't know if I have the graph in my slides. There's a wing of the literature, as I mentioned, that tried to argue that you kind of have the same components of the model, and that these differences in the kind of, it sort of has a middle term that's almost like the urge or the desire to retaliate. These other things that are about whether you're learning that retaliating is bad, whether you're able to suppress it if you can. And the claim was that all these folks have kind of the same failure to adapt, to kind of, adapt your curve, but that this term has different neural bases is kind of how they were thinking about it. But yeah, I don't know if, I think that's actually, in a weird way, I'll try to convince you later, I think related to my degrees of freedom kind of worry. So part of my worry about this is just that some, like retaliating seems to be so kind of possibly multiply realized or behaviorally defined that maybe those kinds of cases just aren't the right ones to adjudicate this kind of debate, and you need things that are more circumscribed.
All right, I think we need to stop this meeting for this morning, since we've reached 11:30. Thanks, Joe, for this really amazing lectures. It's been really wonderful. And also thanks to all for the lively Q&A. We will meet again next week at Thursday, 10 a.m. And we hope to see all of you for the last keynote lecture of this Cognitive Ontology seminar. Thanks, Adina. Again, good to see you. And thanks, Joe. And we'll see you all hopefully next week on Thursday. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.